Hello and welcome to A Healthy Mind. I'm Dr. Cislina Grosser-Ledbetter, Director of Counseling and Student Development at the University of the District of Columbia and your host. On today's edition, our issue is how culture shapes identity and relationships. Joining me to discuss this topic is Dr. Cherian Verghese. Dr. Verghese graduated from the Counseling Psychology program at Temple University in 1987. He spent the next 12 years as a psychologist at the George Washington University Counseling Center and as an adjunct faculty in the psychology and counseling departments. Since 2002, Dr. Verghese has maintained a private practice in Washington, D.C., where he provides counseling and psychotherapy for individuals and couples, and supervision for psychotherapists. He is currently on the faculty for the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, and also teaches at the Washington School of Psychiatry Supervision Training Program. Dr. Verghese continues his university affiliations by providing consulting and training at the counseling centers of the University of Maryland and American University. Dr. Verghese grew up in South India and came to the U.S. in 1970 for higher education. He has special interests and expertise in cultural identity and cross-cultural relationships, and has worked extensively with international and immigrant populations. Welcome, Dr. Verghese. Oh. You've been a busy guy. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have so much to cover, and I really want to kind of get a sense of all of the richness and all that you bring to the table, but talk a little bit about some of the exciting work you're doing right now when it comes to sort of contemporary and contextualizing psychoanalysis. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm very interested in making sure that psychotherapists become more aware of how culture impacts people's development, how culture impacts how we develop healthily, and what's considered not health, and how we define it, even how we define what's mental health, what's psychopathology, all these kind of terms we throw around. How do we decide that? Who decides that? I think these things, culture matters a great deal as to who decides how these things are defined. And so because of that, who then becomes labeled as healthy, unhealthy, whose values become labeled as appropriate or not appropriate.
Yeah, and why is that important? I mean, the traditional thinking in psychotherapy is that if you've got the skill, if you've been trained and you understand the discipline, then all of this other stuff about culture and context is not really relevant. So why is that now important?
Well, that takes an assumption that psychotherapists somehow have this, track into knowing how other people function without being influenced by their culture, their training, their theories, because all these things organize who we are. I mean, for example, for you to think about, what's a good, healthy person in this culture, for example. We talk about how people are healthy when they're autonomous, they can do things on their own. I was going to say toot your own horn.
Right.
You have to be able to talk about yourself in a positive way. And you think when somebody doesn't do that, there's something the matter with them.
Right. We just said that.
You just said that.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but where does that come from? Is that a universal value? Is that a value that goes across all cultures, all races, all gender? So we have to think about where is this value coming from? How do we decide? For example, I work with internationals sometimes when they come here and they're trying to find jobs, they're writing resumes, and you have someone writing saying, I did this job and by the grace of God I did a okay job, because they're not supposed to praise themselves.
Right.
Somebody else may do it, but you can't do that. But imagine sending that to a job application to a job, how that's going to be received, because it's going to be taken in this culture's version and say there's something the matter with this person, right? So psychotherapists are humans who are also raised in their own culture.
Yeah, and how does that play out though
Pardon?
in the therapy relationship?
Well, for example, you have a patient who comes in who sits down and talks, but is not really looking at you. Now, eye contact has a lot of meaning in this culture, because if you're not looking at them, you're lying, right? But where people come from, for example, in the Eastern cultures, looking directly at someone who's an elder or in a higher authority is considered disrespectful. So we can then judge this person to be, depressed or whatever when they're not looking. There's a self-esteem problem or something like that, but that may not be what it means. So that then, complicates how we, or women, for example. We talk about, being direct or certain kind of characteristics that are supposed to be healthy. Dependency is considered a negative quality.
Right.
But, women are trained and grow up being relational. Dependence, interdependence, those kind of things are what, women are trained to be looking for. They're considered nurturing. But those values get trashed when you think about, dependence is a negative quality, okay? Or empathy, for example. That's considered a feminine value rather.
I see.
And analysis is considered a male value. Okay.
Yes.
So these things culturally we get. Maybe I'll tell you a quick.
Sure.
My daughter wrote a paper called "Dangerous Dichotomies." It's very interesting because culture tends to use language in a way that dichotomizes good and bad.
That's right.
Okay,
That's
so
right.
we like to put things into categories.
We do.
So some things are good, some things are bad. So empathy is not very good in certain, certain cultures.
Right.
But then intellect is valued higher.
Correct.
Okay, so if you're dealing with things with emotion, that's not considered very good, but you're supposed to rationally think through problems, which is supposed to be more healthy. So we tend to dichotomize the two, dependence versus independence, okay, black versus white.
Right.
I mean, there are things that end up being categorized one way or the other, and that becomes very difficult for people. We need to categorize, because otherwise, how do we survive if we don't know this is a human being, this is an animal, this is whatever.
And it's so important, like, when you're talking about a therapeutic relationship, to create and you don't have a lot of time to do it, right?
Right.
To let the person know that you kind of get them, that you understand. Recently, and you're going to explain to me why this happened, but recently I had a conversation with a young lady who said she happened to be from Ethiopia. And she said to me, I'm looking for a therapist, but in my network, there are no black therapists. And so therefore, I don't have a therapist. I am not going to sit in front of a white person. I just cannot tell my story in front of a white person. Why did she do that? What do you suspect? I mean, given the context of our conversation,
Right.
I have a hypothesis, but I'm really curious to know why that happens, because that's not a very unique conversation.
Well, first thing I have to think about is what is her unique experience in this cultural sort of context.
Right.
What has been, because I know enough white therapists who are very helpful and can be very helpful to people of color. But if that's not this person's experience, and their experience is of being put down or being not understood, then they can also categorize. Patients can do the same thing as therapists can. So we all are, can do that. But if that's going to be a problem, that can come in the way of how they can relate to the therapist or not.
Right.
So that would be a challenge.
Right. And maybe, at face value, I'm taking what she says as her truth, but maybe she was, as you were saying, talking about her perception that the cultural piece was not there, that they would not really get me.
That they may not.
They're not going to get me.
Right.
Because they don't look like me, and so I can't possibly get them to understand where I'm coming from.
Right.
And I think that may not be a unique perspective of a lot of people.
Right.
And so I wonder, you've got a lot of work to do. I wonder how you get in such a global world, right? And there are so many cultures. I mean, we're here in Washington, D.C., where there are hundreds of cultures and hundreds of countries. So how do you get people to become more competent culturally when there are so many different, cultures that we need to know about in terms of being able to serve people that need us?
Well, one of the things that our professional licensing boards and organizations are starting to do is to require professionals to get certain amount of training in working cross-culturally, in dealing with culture and race and things like that. And I do some, training for that as well for mental health professionals. And, so one of the things I try to do when I work with people who may not have that expertise or exposure is to help them think about culture in a broader sense. Understand, what are the cultural values, for example.
Is that hard?
Pardon?
Is that hard?
Oh, it's pretty hard.
It's really hard.
Yes,
to get, because you have to be kind of evolved, right? To be willing to look at yourself in the face as someone who's racist or prejudiced. And I think you talk about being prejudiced and everybody's prejudiced. And I'd like to hear, because you've got two definitions of being prejudiced, and I'm real curious about sharing that.
Okay. Well, prejudice in the broad sense is that just because we live whatever life we live, in a culture, in a family, in certain time in history, we develop certain ideas, thoughts, feelings about the world that's not necessarily conscious. It's organized from the time we're born. We hear our mothers singing, we hear our mother's language, we hear our family dynamics, we then see what's around us. We are influenced then by what's going on in the culture, if there's a war going on, if there's something else going on. So those all inform the way we understand the world. Okay, and this forms a way that we then look at the world. Okay, if you think about that, as this is how I'm organized inside by all that's happened to me, and then I'm looking at you, I can't get out of this way of thinking entirely because that's what my experience is. So when I look at you, you come also with a similar but different, even from the same culture, even in the same family. For example, if you have a sister, your family is not the same. When your parents had the first child, they're first-time parents, they have to learn to be parents. And by the second time comes, the child is not coming into the same family. There's already 3 people in the family. They have to fit into this system.
It's such a truism.
Okay, so, and I'm the third. So
you're the third?
Right.
I'm the second.
I had to fight. I had 2 older brothers. So
you had to eat.
So we learn about the world from that, from what's going on outside the family. If you're a black family in a culture that's predominantly white, or an immigrant family, those all organize how we see the world. So when I see you and we talk, you come with a certain perspective. So we both have our prejudice or way of seeing the world.
Okay, so you
prejudging.
Okay, so you and I'm going to let you finish, but when you say prejudice, you're just simply talking about context from which we view the world.
Right, and it's an inescapable context, because this is who we are.
Right.
And so we have that, but the challenge is to be aware of that.
That is a
one,
challenge.
The fact that we do have that.
Yeah.
Because when some people, think about, well, I see the world this way, so the world is this way. That's a sort of rigid way of thinking, because that means there can't be another person with a different perspective, which, how do you live with other people?
Dangerous. That's real dangerous. That's fanatical stuff.
Absolutely.
Yes,
that's where fanaticism comes from.
That's right.
So that's something we need to recognize, and I'm sure we all do to some extent. So when we see somebody from a different culture, we say, oh, what's that like? Where you come from? So we know there's that difference.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a prejudice that we're all, part of, and
And then
But
the second prejudice.
the second prejudice is culture and society and politics creates certain ways of seeing things, certain kinds of being to be good, valued, the normal.
I see.
Okay, so that creates anybody who doesn't fit into that becomes not good. Then we create a prejudice against somebody who's not like that. But we also have prejudices because of safety and all those kind of things.
So for survival.
We have to know survivally who's dangerous, because if we didn't know that, we couldn't survive. So we need to be able to categorize and develop prejudices in that way to discriminate, so to speak.
And that's so hard because,
Pardon?
I mean, you just kind of hit on a key word, discriminate. And
Right.
part of what, we kind of talked about a little bit off air is that once, in this culture or this world in America, we want to put people in a place. We want to
Right.
put them in a box. We talk about some of the, the tragedies that are going on around us every day,
Right,
right?
right.
And we just crave being able to, profile forensics. That's $1 billion business to be able to
Right,
say,
right.
if you check off the box, we can identify who you might be.
Right,
In some
right.
ways, it's like a double-edged sword. In some ways, it's our prejudice working, I'm going to say for or against us, but it's definitely at play because we have a desire to put people in a box so we can figure out who they are.
Who they
It's
are.
kind of like that driving while black thing. Have you heard about that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, good. That's good because I
Well, I've
that'd be
heard
good.
of
That'd be
driving
good.
while Indian. And all
Driving
these
while
other
driving while Indian.
My nephews and nieces talk about that.
Get
or my,
outta here.
My young Indian patients talk about
Driving while
that.
where?
Or ordering while Indian, or Asian, or different
What is
kinds
that?
of.
What is ordering while Indian?
Well, we have to be careful.
Yeah.
Because, for example, a young man who's of Asian descent,
Yeah.
he was ordering, and somehow somebody else who's, white got served. Now, we don't know whether this was based on race or not. It's possible, but we don't know. We have to be careful. But what happens is, if this happens in this person's experience over a period of time, we become more sensitized to it, and we may see it, and sometimes we may see it when it's not there.
Well, yes.
So that's the other issue. So
Yes.
when you go to a therapist, for example, this person you were talking about, I forgot where she was from.
She's from Ethiopia.
Ethiopian.
But she was raised there for 7 years and then came here.
Right. So for her, she may have these experiences that predisposes her to feel that, partly because of the reality, because in cultures where colored or foreign might be not as good, we do experience that. But that doesn't mean everybody is going to treat you like that. So when they go to a therapist, whether the therapist is quite that way or not, we may react to some things a certain way and think, because it fits our narrative, so to speak.
Sure.
So we look for things that fit our narrative. So that can happen with the patient or the client as well.
Sure.
So we have to be careful.
Right.
So even a very, open and non-prejudiced therapist can appear, if depending on what it is, to be prejudiced, and we have to be careful with that.
Yeah, and I agree. I think we
Yeah.
have to be careful. But the other piece is that can you be culturally competent and deal with a person in a culturally competent way if you haven't been trained to understand what it means? So that prejudice number one, that we all come to the table with our own issues and our own belief systems that organize the way we see the world.
Right, right.
If you haven't been desensitized, not wrong word, if you haven't been sort of re-educated about what it means to understand to grow up in Southeast DC, and you really don't get that, and you may not in your heart of hearts feel like you're a prejudiced individual, but you just don't, you just don't know. You don't know better. Isn't that what a lot of therapists find themselves in, and maybe part of the reason why, people of color go see a white therapist or go see a therapist of a different color, right? And it doesn't work out. And you can't really put your finger on it all the time.
Right, right.
But something's off.
Right. Right. So that's a good question about how do we know when it's the racial or
Yeah.
difference issue, or when it's a personality issue. Because
Yeah.
when you work with even from the same, I mean, I've supervised tons of psychologists,
Yeah.
psychotherapists, and trained them. Just because a therapist is black working with a black patient,
That's right.
or an Indian therapist working with an Indian patient, doesn't mean there's no prejudice or
That's
other things
right.
that comes into that either.
That's right.
Or that and you also have to think about that individual's level of cultural identity development, even within that culture, the black culture or immigrant culture.
Yeah.
You can have some, for example, a black patient who may seek a white therapist because the white
That's
therapist is considered more
The authority.
legitimate.
That's right.
They have a natural authority
That's right.
that the culture confers on them.
That's right.
So they may feel more comfortable because they think that person is probably going to be better.
Right.
There's an interesting thing. I remember when Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond
Yes.
Tutu, after there was the freedom to speak and all this, and he was flying in an airplane. And he said, somebody told him it was a black African who was actually piloting the plane, and he became anxious, and he said, "Oh my gosh, can our boys fly
Oh yeah.
this kind of plane?"
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is an internalized racism.
Yes.
So
Yes.
he had internalized the cultural narrative that blacks are not as good,
Yes, I get that.
the apartheid narrative that they're not as good.
Right.
So we have people at so many different levels of cultural awareness, and so it is true for white Americans or Asian Americans.
It is.
We all have such different levels of awareness, openness, and so
and you talk about awareness and open-mindedness, and one of the things that you use is, and you're going to correct me, the free association. What do you learn from that? Tell me
from
what it
free
is
association.
first. Tell me what it is first, and
Well-
then tell us how does that work? How do you learn where someone is from
Free
that?
associating.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a technical term,
Right.
And it was developed, and it's a very hard thing to do,
Yes,
really.
it is.
Because we have a way of censoring ourselves when
do.
we talk to people, because we want people to like us
Right.
and have good opinions of us. So we can limit what we share with someone else.
Yeah.
But not only that, we have difficulty knowing some things because those things have been painful, traumatic, or whatever it is, or an unallowed kind of thought
Right.
that is not allowed to come up.
Right.
So we may censure ourselves consciously or unconsciously. A lot of it is unconscious, and that's where our work is.
And that's
Right.
where the work is. And
Yeah.
so free association, for those who may not know, is in your teachings
Right.
when you have a set of language,
Right.
and then the other person responds.
Uh-huh.
How have you developed a very keen sense of where someone is based on the kind of language they give you back, or is it hard just because everybody is so super censored that they know what to give you back? Because I think after time, people will probably slip up and say some of the things that are really deep.
Well, that's the hope, that we can get them to say things that are very deep, because the things that are easy to say when they first come in is probably not the most useful,
Right.
because they're used to saying that. They can say that to their friends, to their family, or whatever. So what's the point in going and talking to a therapist
Right.
if all you say is things that you can tell anybody else?
But that's also good in your
Pardon?
training of the
Pardon?
therapist.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you listen? And my job is initially just essentially to help listen to them and try and understand, how what they're saying about their life, so that I can put myself into their experience world. This is what empathy is about. If when you're telling me about your story, you know, if I just listen to it and check it off against my experience or the you know, norm, that's not going to help me to really understand you. I have to think about, tell me about your family, your history, tell me about you growing up. So if you grew up this way, if you live in this situation, if you have this kind of circumstances, you know, family-wise, culture-wise, race-wise, all these things, then I can slowly start getting to understand, oh, so this is why you have this kind of feeling about this or that, and this is why this may be creating some difficulties.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that that's a constant strand that runs through all kinds of work, all kinds of therapy work, is that you've got to understand the context from which a person
Absolutely,
comes.
absolutely.
And I remember taking a course in psychoanalysis, and the therapist saying, the teacher saying, well, I continued to bring up things like culture, and how relevant it was. And it was almost, and I honestly don't think that it was intentional, but it was almost dismissed as, if you get the technique down, I think I'm paraphrasing, if you get the technique down, then the rest of the stuff doesn't matter. Because psychoanalysis, while it may be an imperfect science, is still very pure in what we're doing. We know where we're going with this. So if you apply the process, honor the process, and it will work for you. And it never worked for me.
Did it work for you?
Not, I mean, you know, that statement didn't quite work, because I still think that you have to understand from whence a person comes.
Well, you know, not only that, but you have to think about, where does psychoanalysis come from? It's not a pure theory of how human beings are. It came from a man at a certain time in history. And, you know, it was from Freud, who came at a time, he was a Jew, during the Holocaust, you know, during a time when people were murdering, you know, groups of people.
Wow.
Is that going to impact our theories? Of course.
Of course.
So
absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I can't believe we're out of time. I told you this is going to be the fastest. Yes, this is going to be the fastest 27 second minutes ever. But I would like to thank you. This has really been fascinating to have this conversation with you. Dr. Cherian Verghese, for being my guest. I really appreciate you coming in today.